Welcome to episode 44 of the Global Travel Planning Podcast. In this episode, I chat with Shandos Cleaver, author of Off the Leash in Australia, who shares her experiences and top tips for travelling with your dog. Shandos has explored over 36 countries with her miniature dachshund, Schnitzel, and provides invaluable advice for planning dog-friendly adventures, whether in Australia or abroad. Hi and welcome to the Global Travel Planning Podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Collins, who with my expert guests will take you on a weekly journey to destinations around the globe, providing travel inspiration, itinerary ideas, practical tips and more to help you plan your next travel adventure. Welcome to episode 44 of the podcast. Today I'm joined by Shandos Cleaver, author of Off the Leash in Australia and an expert in dog-friendly travel. Shandos has travelled with her miniature dachshund, Schnitzel, to over 36 countries across 3 continents. And in this episode, she shares her insights on making travel with your pup smooth and enjoyable. We start by hearing about Shandos' background and her journey into dog-friendly travel, before diving into her adventures with Schnitzel, from planes and trains to road trips and even a ferry ride from Stockholm to Helsinki. Shandos also shares practical tips for those planning to travel with their dogs, whether you're exploring Australia or heading overseas. We wrap up the episode with Shandos' must-know tip for travelling with your furry friend. So if you've ever thought about taking your dog on an adventure, you won't want to miss this episode, so let's dive in.
I'm Shandos Cleaver and I live in Sydney, Australia. I run a travel blog called Travelnuity, which as of this year, it's going to be 10 years old. It's hard to believe that I've been running it that long. And ever since the end of 2017, I've been focused on dog-friendly travel. And most recently, last year, I published my first book called Off the Leash in Australia, which is a dog-friendly travel guide to Australia. And the star of both my blog and my book is my little miniature dachshund, Schnitzel.
So tell us a little bit about Schnitzel, Shandos, because I've just been chatting to you before we start recording, because I used to have a little miniature dachshund called Sally, who unfortunately didn't get to travel as much as Schnitzel has. So how old is Schnitzel? I know he's not a miniature dachshund, is he?
He is a miniature.
Size, is he? Or he's miniature as well. Oh, cool. So tell us a little bit about Schnitzel.
So Schnitzel, he is now 12 years old and he has slowed down a lot, but he has done a lot during his years. When we got him, and for the first couple of years that we had him, we actually never traveled with him except for taking him to my parents and sometimes having like nights away down the coast. So he was used to going into a car and he got really excited when he knew that we were going somewhere and he would like bark and bark until he got into the car or run up and down the hallway. But we didn't start traveling with him until I had started my travel blog and I had some early success and we thought we want to go traveling overseas, but we have a dog. And then we just thought, well, why don't we give it a try? Go over to Europe for a couple of years. And at this point, we'd sold our house to help fund our traveling. And we thought, why don't we take Schnitzel overseas and we'll see how he goes. And at that point, we didn't even know if he would handle travel. He had only once ever stayed in a hotel. So we just didn't know how it would go. But he actually really enjoys traveling. And as long as he's with us and he's got his bed, he's traveled really well. And so in the years since, he's visited 36 countries, nearly all in Europe, but he's also been to the US. He's been to 10 states in the US. And in Australia, he's been to every state and territory except for Tasmania. In 2021, we spent 6 months traveling in Australia in a camper van, and a lot of that formed the basis of my book, Off the Leash.
That's absolutely fantastic. He must be the most well-travelled dog in the world. He has to be. It's amazing.
He is one of them. Like, I've come across some other dogs more recently who travel quite a bit, but then it's sometimes hard to compare. It's like, do you count countries? Do you count the amount of time? Do you start counting this and that?
It's still incredible, though. So you've travelled to basically 3 continents, Australia, Europe, and the US. So let's talk about traveling with Schnitzel in each of those different countries to start off. I think that's a good starting point. So let's compare how dog friendly is Australia and Europe and the US? And I know with Europe we've got lots of countries we could potentially talk about. So how dog friendly would you kind of rate each of those different places?
So Australia, like my home country, unfortunately, it's not the most dog-friendly place, but I do believe it is improving. There's a lot more hotels that are dog-friendly, particularly luxury hotels, great for a staycation. The other thing is there's a lot of dog-friendly caravan parks. When we travel around Australia, I would say that about 3/4 of caravan parks are dog-friendly, though that is generally if you're staying in your own caravan, camper van or tent, not always for pet-friendly cabins. So having your own camper van like we did when we travel around Australia or your own caravan makes it a lot easier. Particularly there's some of the remote places where there's no options to stay in dog-friendly hotels or cabins. There's a lot of dog-friendly cafes, and the great thing about Australia is that the weather is generally quite good, so it's quite good for sitting outside and dining outside in beer gardens, or else there's ones with heaters because like we're all wimps here in Australia when it comes to the cold.
Yeah.
But the other thing I'll say that is really dog-friendly in Australia is the number of beaches. Now, you wouldn't believe this if you lived in Sydney, which is where I live at the moment, because there's not many dog-friendly beaches. But outside of the cities and in some of the other cities in Australia, like there are so many beautiful dog-friendly beaches. There's just so many to go around. Though the other thing is then the hardest thing about dog travel when it comes to Australia is actually getting a dog into the country. So unless you're already here or you're relocating, like it's not really worthwhile going through all the hoops, all the vet visits, the quarantine and so on. And it's a very expensive process, which I can attest to because I went through it once with Schnitzel.
Yes, it certainly is.
So that's Australia. And then I find the US is kind of like an intermediate, like people don't view it as dog friendly as Europe, though I'd say it's generally more dog friendly than Australia. It depends also where you are in the country. One of the things I really liked about the US in comparison to Australia is that dogs are allowed in national parks there, though there are restrictions, but at least like if you're going to lookouts, if you're driving through in a car, like that's all fine. Whereas generally in Australia, dogs aren't even allowed at all in national parks unless you're driving through on a highway. The one funny thing that I didn't really come across in the US, but I heard reports of, it says depending on the state or the county that you're in, dogs may or may not be allowed on what they call patios, the outdoor dining areas, which, yeah, that was something that I found unusual. And then the first place that we traveled with Schnitzel was Europe, and part of the reason we chose that because it has a reputation as being very dog friendly, though there are differences between different parts of Europe. For instance, we started in Spain, and Spain is generally not the most dog friendly place. There's some places we found cafes and restaurants that would allow dogs inside. In other places, not so many, whereas then we found probably one of the most dog-friendly places is Italy, where dogs were just allowed in so many places. There are even some supermarkets that allow dogs inside. We actually got told off at one supermarket because we were carrying Schnitzel and we were told, no, he had to be on the ground. I guess they made sure that they didn't have anything that dogs could eat at ground level. And I guess
that's smart.
The other thing that helps in Italy is that they're not always strict about following rules, which helps when it comes to rules regarding dogs. A lot of people think that actually France would be more dog friendly, but I think the difference I found with France is that dogs aren't allowed in a lot of parks, whereas that wasn't really the case I found in Italy. Though the other thing to watch out for in Italy is Naples, which I really enjoyed as a city, but you got to watch where you walk. That I found is to be one of the most, places where people don't pick up after the dogs as much. And I guess the other thing is the United Kingdom, like whether or not that's dog friendly. And there's a lot of people I met in the UK who were like, oh, no, it's not that dog friendly. It's nowhere near as dog friendly as Europe. But I don't know, like I found it really dog friendly, and it was easy to find out information about whether places did or didn't allow dogs. It's usually clearly there on their website. There's a lot of cafes and stuff like that where they'll have a sign in the window, shops with a sign in the window. And on my most recent visit to the UK, I discovered that there's quite a few churches and cathedrals in England that allow dogs inside them, which is not something I've really found in other places. I remember going into the cathedral in Bristol and I said, so when did you start allowing dogs? And they're like, oh, well, we've kind of always allowed it. We've just never said no or never really publicised it.
Oh, that's amazing. I have to say, I think the UK it seems to me to be incredibly dog friendly. Everywhere I go, like I was telling you yesterday, I was staying at a beautiful hotel at the weekend, and was down at breakfast yesterday morning at the table next to us. They had their dog with them at breakfast, which it was lovely to see. And he was such a friendly little dog. So you definitely see more of that in the last few years, I would say, in the UK. It's definitely, I think a lot of people got dogs over the pandemic. It seemed to be a thing, and so there was a huge kind of reaction to making things far easier for people with dogs.
I think it's been the similar in Australia, that there's just a lot more dogs. And it was really during the pandemic that a lot more of the hotels became dog friendly because they didn't have the business travelers, and also a lot of the international travelers. So they're like, well, what can we do to have people stay here? So then they started allowing dogs, and then they charged the fees as well, usually.
Yeah.
And then put on like the special dog dining menus sometimes, and the dog grooming, and really it's definitely a great way to have a staycation.
So definitely a bit of pampering as well for Schnitzel. So tell us about, if you're planning to travel with your dog, and you listen at the minute, and I'm sure listeners are kind of going, I love that idea, but I'm not quite sure what sort of things I need to do in terms of preparing kind of legally. Do I need to look at injections? Do I need to look at, paperwork, but also preparing, Schnitzel for travel?
Well, probably one thing to do is to start with a simple trip, like close to home, either staying somewhere close by or a road trip where you can just see how your dog handles it, and just see, because there's some dogs who just don't handle traveling in cars and stuff like that. And the last thing you want to find out is you're starting on like a camper van trip around Australia and you discover, my dog really gets car sick and it's not going away. So start simple and see how you go. The other thing is, like, think about your dog's behavior. So before we went to Europe, we did see a dog trainer because we knew that Schnitzel wasn't the best behaved all the time. He can get away with a lot because he's very small. So like we can always like pick him up and move him. We're never at a risk of him like stealing food off the table at a cafe because he's just too small. But he isn't always the best behaved at cafes. So we spoke to a dog trainer. We had a couple of sessions and tried to learn some tricks, which I must admit that I think we didn't really learn it that well. It's just as much about the owners learning the training as the dogs. So when we were traveling around Europe, I had a tendency to have him sitting on my lap underneath the table, and I learned to eat one-handed, so that I could keep him in there. And of course, the other thing is, depending on where you go, you may have other things to prepare. So the biggest thing is if you're traveling internationally. Obviously, if you are thinking about going somewhere overseas, the first thing is to consider what are the requirements for a dog, because different countries have different requirements. The most common thing is to have that the dog needs to have a microchip, and also had to have a rabies vaccination and sometimes a health certificate. So for example, dogs going to places in the European Union, they require that. So when Schnitzel, he flew to Spain, leaving Australia. So we went to a vet and got a rabies, and then he had the health certificate when he was leaving. On the other hand, there are places where if you go and investigate the requirements, you might be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't take my dog there. So, for instance, Australia is a really hard country to fly to with a dog. As Johnny Depp discovered when his dog was deported. Well, that or the threat of they were going to get put down. But yeah, Australia, dogs need to go through a lot of processes and there's quarantine involved. It's similar for places like New Zealand. There's a lot of extra rules for Hawaii and other islands that are generally rabies free. So always double check everything that's required. And if possible, look at the government websites, which have the full information. Don't just listen to someone on TikTok.
That's a good one. Good advice. So you did all that preparation with Schnitzel. You got all the paperwork and everything. So your first kind of flight with Schnitzel was then from Australia to Spain. So how did he travel on the airplane?
So that one, we organised that with a pet transport company, partly because we had no idea what we were doing. And I even think back to, I can't even remember when I worked out some of the steps involved because I was clueless, but I went to a pet transport company and they were the ones who organised the flight, partly because at that point he could only fly in cargo leaving Australia. So he had a long flight with Qantas, first of all, to Dubai, and then he flew with Emirates to Madrid. So he had, it was a very long process, there's a lot of people who are reluctant to put their pets in cargo flights. But when you're flying to and from Australia, it's generally the only option. So we were worried, but he handled it really well and he was very happy to see us on the other end. When we got reunited, he was just jumping all over the place. So then we remembered to take him out, and he did the longest pee I've ever seen him do. I don't know how.
Oh, bless him.
I think actually, when he was in Dubai, he got taken to the kennel next to the airport. So we spent all our money on his flight and him being looked after. And then we just slept on some lounges in the airport in London because we couldn't afford to pay for a hotel for ourselves. He's done a couple of flights in cargo, the same when he came back to Australia. But the rest of the time, we're actually really lucky with Schnitzel. We had no idea of this beforehand, that he's small enough to fly in the cabin. So when we've flown around Europe, when he flew to the US and an extra flight in the US, each of those times he flew in the cabin with us at our feet. So usually that applies to smaller dogs, often a maximum of 8 kilos, including their carrier, and they need to be then in their carrier bag at your feet, and it's a lot easier to keep an eye on them. And you don't have to worry about what happens if there's a delayed flight, or then they're there with you.
That's good. I was going to say, I remember a flight from South Africa. This is probably 30 something years ago, a long haul flight, South Africa. So it was Johannesburg to Athens, and there was a little dog on that flight. I remember, and this is a long, long time ago. And it's something you see far more regularly now, that you see the little dogs on the flights with you, which is, I think I would prefer that. I just would like to know that my dog's with me. And I know you can't do it when you go to some places, but I'm sure Schnitzel's happy to sit on the plane. Does he cope with that? Is he okay on the flight?
He handles it really well. Generally on the flight, he doesn't make a peep. I have learned that I shouldn't open the zip too much, otherwise he tries to poke his nose out and then get his entire head out. One of the only times he made noise was because sometimes people clap when a flight lands. I'm not sure why they do that, and he doesn't like clapping, so then he started barking, and then you get people looking around, oh, there's a dog, because they hadn't even realized there was a dog. Yeah. I will also say that the flight that we took we flew from Paris to New York. You have never experienced being cramped on a long-haul flight until you're flown with a dog at your feet. So it was a budget airline flight, completely packed, and having Schnitzel take out my entire leg room. and I'm a tall person. Yeah, that was the most cramped I've ever been on a flight, but I did it for Schnitzel.
Oh, and I'm sure you appreciated it. So tell me a little bit about your travel we've talked a little bit about, obviously, you've taken flights. So when you've traveled around Australia, you've had the camper van. What about in Europe and the US? So how many types of different transportation has Schnitzel experienced?
He's been on about everything possible. In Europe, one of our favourite ways to travel around was train, just because, well, the same reason like everyone likes to take the trains, like they go right into the city centre and like they're pretty reliable. And most of the trains in Europe do allow dogs on, particularly small dogs. There are a few trains like in Spain that don't allow large dogs. We also did a couple of trains when we were in the US, taking the Amtrak train from New York down to Washington, DC. But we've also done a lot of driving, particularly like when we were traveling around the west coast of the US, that was mainly driving, and also some parts of Europe, particularly when we wanted to visit some out-of-the-way places. But then he's also been on buses. He's been on ferries, including overnight ferries. We took a ferry in between Stockholm and Helsinki, and we had
that last month.
and we had a pet-friendly cabin that he was allowed inside. Yeah. And he was allowed up on the upper deck on that one, which that was really nice. And what else have we had? About everything possible.
I think trains are amazing. I'm just talking about that. We did a train trip from Krakow to Budapest just before Christmas. And the couple that was sitting opposite us, they had their dog with them as well. And actually getting on and off that train, constantly there were people getting on and off with the dogs. Well, they had the couple opposite us with their dog. And then we had another couple who sat on the next set of seats, kind of opposite. And they came out with quite a big dog, but he just sat so comfortably in between the two rows of seats as like a V shape, and he just sat there quite comfortably, quite happy, just watching everybody. It was really cool.
Schnitzel here's really enjoyed train rides. Like, I don't know if they still have them in Europe. Like, there's those old-fashioned ones with the compartments, and there was one that we took that was about a whole day, and then like he ended up getting passed around between us and the other people, like sitting on everyone's laps. And he's pretty well behaved. There was one time that we caught it from Bratislava up to Berlin, and we were a little bit concerned with that, but we knew that he would be stopping for a while in Prague. So we thought we'd let him off and have a break when we're in Prague. But of course, then the train was running late. And so that's when we discovered that he could hold on for 8 hours if he really needed to.
Oh, I was going to ask the next question is, I guess, in terms of that, what sort of equipment, what sort of things do you need to take for Schnitzel? Because does he have his own little suitcase?
Well, we've got a bag for him, and the other thing is if he's not actually in his carry bag, we'd use that for extra storage for his stuff. But the main things we'd take would be fairly simple things like his food, a water bowl, a food bowl, his bed. Like, have to take his bed. Like, even if hotels supply their own beds, I kind of like to take my own just because he knows it. And sometimes some of the beds are designed for bigger dogs than him. But then we kind of kept it pretty simple because we didn't want to get loaded down with too much luggage because we were carrying his luggage and our luggage and carrying him.
Wow.
And dealing with trains and buses, yes, it's a bit of a handful.
I would say the more you have, the more stressful it is. But I guess Schnitzel's like when you travel with children, you've got to watch the child. You have to watch Schnitzel. You've got to watch all the luggage as well that you've got to carry because they can't carry it for themselves. So it adds that little element. So I know it would be I'm sure take less things for yourself because you obviously had Schnitzel and the things for him.
And backpacks are really handy for when you've got a hand taken up looking after a dog.
Absolutely. So let's talk about your most memorable experiences. So, and I guess the most memorable experiences for yourself, but also for Schnitzel. So what are the things that you look back on and go, oh, that was just priceless. That was fantastic.
One of our favourite memories is we did a road trip around Scandinavia. So we hired a car for about a month and we went up through Sweden and then back down through Norway. It's just some stunning scenery in Norway in particular. If we realized that ignore what Google Maps says and follow the scenic routes instead. And there's just some beautiful ones, which we could just do with Schnitzel. So probably, yeah, some of the beautiful places that we've been and he's been allowed have been some of our favorite memories. Things like when we went to the Grand Canyon in the US, and dogs allowed along the rim trail and the various lookouts along there. So we didn't go and hike down into the canyon because dogs aren't allowed down there, but we just took in so much and stayed for the sunset, and it was just such a magical experience.
So what about the funniest thing that's ever happened to you when you've been traveling with Schnitzel?
It depends on whether you want something that's amusing or something that was more dramatic. When we were in...
We have to share both now, Shandos.
I remember when we were in Venice, we were walking around and someone stopped us and tried to ask us in Italian the directions for somewhere, and we realized that no, they were Australian. And they thought that we were locals because we had a dog, and you just get into conversations with people and get chatting for ages because you just connect because of a dog.
Yeah, that's so true.
On the other hand, when we were in Santorini, as you do, we were trying to watch the sunset from, I think there's that popular sunset spot. So we were at a bar, having some drinks in the afternoon, and then we had to leave it because you had to have a booking and spend a fortune to stay there. So we were looking for somewhere else to view the sunset. And then we just heard a meow, and a cat charged around the corner at Schnitzel, and it was a semi-stray cat that had a kitten nearby, which we had no idea, and it was used to defending itself against the local stray dogs. So it charged at Schnitzel, and Joel, my husband, picked Schnitzel up by his leash and ended up getting scratches on his leg, and then there was one little scratch on Schnitzel's ear. So I will say it didn't end up being that big a drama. We found the names of the vets, and we found one that was near our hotel. And we went to the vet, and it was still open and didn't even charge us that much. But the only thing was, and we missed out on seeing the sunset on Santorini.
No.
We were at the vet instead, and Schnitzel was having this little patchy stuff put on his ear.
Oh, bless. That actually leads a bit to a good question about insurance. So can you if you've got dog insurance, pet insurance, does that cover you when you're overseas?
It depends on where you're from and the rules with the insurance. There's some of the insurance policies in the UK and the US will cover you, but there's only some of them, most of them don't, and you need to check the conditions. They may say that it only covers you up to a certain amount of period. I think for the Australian pet insurance, Australian pets don't usually travel overseas, so yeah, there isn't anything that will cover you. So instead, yeah.
So add a little bit extra into your budget.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So tell us what has been the best thing about traveling with Schnitzel?
I think just when you're traveling for a dog, it encourages you to really slow down and appreciate things. It does mean that there's some things that you can't do. If you aren't that fond of visiting museums, having a dog traveling with you is a great excuse to get out of going to all those must-see museums and skipping the queues entirely. But yeah, it's just with a dog, often it's just good to just wander around and just take in the ambience and just take things slowly and just see what comes up. And the other thing is we do end up talking a lot more to people when we're traveling with Schnitzel than when we travel without him, and just people asking stuff about Schnitzel even if you don't speak the same language.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here now, Shanna. So Schnitzel's travelled to 30 plus countries. So if you could travel to one country outside of Australia, so we'll leave Australia because that's his home country. If you could travel back to one country from all of those with Schnitzel, where would you choose?
That's a really hard question. I don't know. I would really like to go back and spend some time in France. But then, actually, one of the surprising countries that we really enjoyed with Schnitzel was Slovenia, in the Balkans. It was really dog friendly. It was just a really enjoyable country to travel in and spend time. I would love to spend some more time there, but the only thing is it's not that big a country, so if I can only go to one, maybe I should go to one of the bigger countries.
I was going to say, and if I asked Schnitzel the same question, what would he say?
Now, Schnitzel probably would give the same answer as your typical 2-year-old and has no idea that there's even different countries, and he has no idea that he's traveled to all these different places. I don't know whether the grass smells different in some places. He was really fond of rolling some of the really lush grass that we came across in Europe. But no, he has no idea.
He'll just be happy to be with you when he travels, I'm sure.
Oh, yes.
Now, I always end the podcast with the same question. And there might be quite a lot of answers to this question. So I'm going to ask you kind of the number one thing that you'd recommend for somebody traveling for the first time with a dog. But if you want, you could add a few more in there before you kind of hit the top number one, because there might be a few things you want to recommend.
Well, actually, if I was going to stick to just one thing, probably the one thing I recommend is just, there's a lot of people, if they haven't traveled with a dog before, they think, oh, this isn't going to work out. This is going to be too restrictive. In particular, people who are thinking about doing a big lap around Australia, and they're like, oh, well, if I've got a dog, then I can't go to national parks or do this or that. But the thing is, most people I know who then have traveled with a dog, they're like, I really enjoy this. I really I'm glad that I took my dog along. We made things work. And it was just so great having my dog with me. After all, they're part of the family. And so probably the number one thing I'd say is just go ahead and do it. Don't talk yourself out of it. You're going to have a great time.
Brilliant. Oh, thanks so much, Shandos, for chatting to us on this week's episode of the podcast. I know this will be a very popular episode. We've got, there's so many dog lovers out there who want to travel with a dog. They're just not 100% sure about taking that leap. So I think it's great to find out from somebody who has done that, and from Schnitzel, who's done so much travels himself and obviously enjoyed it. That's amazing. So thanks so much for joining us this week.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Global Travel Planning Podcast. For more details and links to everything we discussed today, check out the show notes at globaltravelplanning.com. Remember, if you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review on your favourite podcast app, because your feedback helps us reach more travel enthusiasts just like you. Anyway, that leaves me to say, as always, happy global travel planning.